Hello, hello, everyone. It's so good to be here with you. Having a little technical difficulty, so my intro did not play, which I'm
Oh,
so surprised about. And I'm really disappointed a little bit. Not sure why it didn't happen, but we are here anyway. I'm here with Jodie Paterson. She is an amazing person. She is a former circus acrobat. She graced a national magazine at the age of 10. She started a beauty skincare line, and she's been lauded as a beauty maven by Oprah and by W Magazine. She has just done some wonderful, amazing, extraordinary things, and she is going to be here to tell us whether those extraordinary things became about because of nurture or nature. Welcome, welcome, Jodie.
welcome. Thank you so much. But wait, you left off one of the most important things of who I am.
A mother,
Yeah.
an author, a mother, an author.
Sister of,
Yes.
of four women. There are four of us, and I'm a sister. So that's really important to put in that bio.
This is true. Yes. You happen to be my sister. And I'm really thankful that you were able to come on this broadcast today because you have such a packed, busy schedule. And I actually had to juggle other people around to get you on here. And so I'm just grateful that you were able to participate today. Tell me a little bit about your family history and how you came to be such an extraordinary or do all these extraordinary things.
Okay, so I grew up in New York City, in what I like to consider an actively Black family. I've termed it an actively Black family, and I think I got that term from my aunt, from Aunt Lerma. And for that means for me that the art that was in our house, the music that played, the conversation at the dinner table was all sort of centered in Black culture. And so although we lived in white neighborhoods, and we went to private schools, oftentimes that were predominantly white, or we were in social circles that were predominantly white, the culture in our home was very Black. And I would say also very feminine. And also very Southern. So even though we were raised in New York City, our mom's family was from the South. And so a lot of the Southern ways seeped into our New York City life. And then oftentimes in the summer, we would go down south to visit with our grandmother and our great grandmother and our aunties and uncles. And so I would say that we were Southern sort of raised in a sense. But then at the same time, we had this very artistic and free-spirited and in a sense aggressive Northern nature that was fostered by our father, who was from Harlem. And I remember that sort of that combination of Southern roots and Southern activism and Southern manners mixed with New York grit and New York fire. One of the memories that's really good for me is when, I don't know if you remember this, but when we didn't want to brush our hair, Daddy would say, okay, great, let's do an Afro contest. Who has the biggest Afro by Easter? I think you always won that because mine would kind of like flop. Yours would just go woof. And it wasn't just the Afro. It wasn't the contest. It was like, you don't have to brush your hair. You don't have to be pretty. You don't have to speak proper English, but you have to do something rebellious almost, or like against the status quo. So I felt very encouraged. When I think back on it now, I felt that we were raised and encouraged to challenge the status quo, whether that was in our hair or in our dress. We wanted to wear jeans, dirty jeans under our dresses all the time. Mama would say no, and Daddy would say yes, right? So this idea of like, you're not born to be pretty, you're born to be powerful. Do something powerful. That was a part of our upbringing. And then there were just the people. Like we had great revolutionaries in our family. Our grandma, Gloria, was jailed dozens of times for going up against school boards and hospitals and the segregated South. She was dubbed Ms. Revolution for her work in the Civil Rights era. She married 5 men. Well, she married 5 times. Actually, one man she married twice.
One man twice. Right, exactly.
So just in that sense alone, right? That is against the status quo. And I don't think she was doing it to be against the status quo, but that was just her nature. Mm-hmm. She did what was inside of her. And she had a master's and a PhD in an era that did not recognize a woman's genius at all. So she went straight for what she wanted. Our mom opened up a private school in Harlem for Black families because she understood education to be power. And then we had Daddy, who had the first Black brokerage firm on Wall Street. And he was using this tool of money as revolution. Gil Scott-Heron, who had a family with our auntie, Aunt Lerma. He sort of did, artistic revolution. She did corporate revolution, and somehow together they had a child and they had a family outside of the legalities of marriage. They just did it their own way. So when you look at the music of Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, that was the kind of message that we were getting all the time, that it's an internal thing and you can do from inside and then sort of bring it to the outside. But it all starts here and then you can transform the world. So I would say we were an actively Black family. We were full of revolutions. And I would
what I think is interesting is if you go back several generations, on our father's side, our great-great-great-grandfather escaped slavery. Mm. He and his wife were separated. He and his son were on one plantation, and he and his wife and son were on another plantation. And they devised a plan to meet up and escape slavery. And that's how, and they ended up choosing the good slave owner, the least aggressive slave owner's name as Paterson to be our family name. But when you look at this idea of passing down, the grit, the fire to do things, we have that sort of on both sides. If you look at this person, escaping slavery and all the things that were required of him to get his children and himself and his wife on 2 different plantations out of the South. I mean, that's amazing. And then you go back like on our mother's side, and the interviews will be with our mother's family. You go back on that side and you have a minister, educators, journalists, the list goes on, and people who were fighting against the norms, fighting against what you were supposed to do as a Black person, what you were supposed to do as a woman. And I think it's really telling about who we are. And you look back at this idea of genetics, epigenetics, and I'm wondering if you feel like it's something that is inside of you that gave you that grit, that fire to just keep pushing on, to do whatever you want to do, not feeling limited, or do you think it's that you were groomed by your ancestors, by your parents?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm not a scientist and I don't think through the lens of science per se. So I don't know what it is exactly or precisely, but what I think that I'm more of a writer. And so I think it's this, when I think of why I do the things I do, or why I talk the way I talk and share the information the way I share it, I think it's about like it's about preserving something that I know to be true in life. And most of what I know to be true, many things that I know to be true have gone unlooked by most people, or have gone unpreserved or unbelieved or just unseen. And so a lot of what I'm doing is noticing what I know, this little bit of the world I know, and then asking it to not be forgotten. And so sometimes I try to imitate the people that came before me, literally stand in front of the mirror, try. Sometimes it's just natural. Like I can hear myself sounding like my mom. I can hear myself sounding like you. We pull our mouths down the same way.
Right. We had that conversation just before starting the live podcast.
I know there's something that's just sort of like, I can't control it, but a lot of what I'm trying to do is to bring the world that I know existed or exists to the forefront. And that's very intentional. Like I'm trying to not have it get lost. The world that we know, the family that we know, the experiences. Because if you look at, literature or television or media or Instagram or, I'll take back Instagram, but the dominant classic media, I don't see what I know. So like I'm trying to put it out there now. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing with social media, trying to show the world that they know. Our world happens to be very Black, very female dominated, also male dominated, masculine energy, but there's a lot of feminine energy in our history. And I'm really trying my best to bring that to the forefront so it doesn't go unseen. So I think that's very intentional. I don't know, is that, I don't know the science behind that. You know what I mean? Well, I just feel it's like in here.
Right. So epigenetics basically is this idea that your parents or your mother specifically, you have what's in your DNA. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a scientist either, so I'm saying this in sort of in layman's terms, but you have your DNA from both your parents, but epigenetics says that those markers can change based on environment, based on environment, your parents, like upbringing, and based on society, based on circumstances, things like that. And also like what your mother is eating, I suppose, like, the foods you eat. So it's based on, so a person could have the genetic marker for, let's say, breast cancer, but they don't necessarily have, it doesn't have to epigenetics means that it could change based on the environment, whether that happens or not. Yeah. And so what's curious to me is that we have this family of people who do all these extraordinary things. And so it's very curious to me on whether we were being groomed. I mean, in some ways, I think we were slightly groomed. I remember one time we were told that we had to send thank you letters after someone sent us a gift. And I refused. I was like, I'm not sending a thank you letter. And so our grandmother wrote back. She sent me gifts and she wrote back and she said, I'm so sorry that you're feeling that way. And, but I think it's very important that you do write a thank you letter. And she was so gracious about it, right? Like she didn't like scold me. She didn't. Yeah, of course. I mean, afterwards, I felt guilty probably. I was like, and she gave me gifts, right, too. Like she probably sent me a dress or, I don't know, a doll or a coloring book or a book to read or something. And she just was so gracious about it. But it's sort of like this grooming of like, be gracious, accept, these gifts with grace. And,
I think a lot of what I noticed is that there was a grooming of inquisitiveness. Mm-hmm. So like, I don't think that you and I act exactly the same, although we do have little quirks that are similar. And I don't think that mommy and I act the same exactly. But I think that, so I don't know if she groomed us in her image, but I think that what they did was they pushed us to inquire and to like turn the page and to turn the corner and to pull back the veil. And so like when I think about, and I'm not saying we did it on our own, I'm saying that I think there was some parental, from generation to generation to generation push for us to explore. What we've explored and how we've explored is kind of unique and nuanced. There's this book I'm reading called Thought Revolution, and it's like, it talks about the left brain and the right brain. So the right brain is connected to like logic and safety and patterns, finding patterns, right? The right brain always wants to find the safe pattern, risk adverse. And the left brain, or is it the other way around?
Right.
One side, the other side is more exploratory and wants to find new ways and new patterns, right? And so I think our parents had us tap into both. There was like we did have repetition. We had a fairly conservative family. We did things, we found a pattern in life. Oftentimes we stuck with it, but then there was also that push to explore new, potentially risky patterns. I mean, you were the one who explored risky opportunities all the time as a teenager. Then I did it probably in my 20s and 30s as an adult, exploring risk. But I think that was something that our parents pushed on us to explore.
Yeah. So where do you think your passion comes from? From that exploring, yeah. Or is it coming from somewhere else, like deep inside of you?
That's a good question. I think we are a passionate family. We all have strong opinions. We bring them to the table. We're asked to bring them to the table. I think also like the way that sports were nurtured by Dad. There's competition in us, maybe not competition with the other person, but like an inner competition. So we're trying to figure ourselves out or drive ourselves to do more. That I think is part of the passion I have. I can't just write one book.
You have to write 10, 20, 30.
Another one. And I got mad at myself the other day because, last couple months ago, I was really upset because I'd written a book and then I wrote a children's book and I was trying to write a third book while the second book was still just coming out. And I couldn't write the third book. I couldn't nail it. And so I was really upset with myself. That want to do more can be a doozy. But I think I think it comes from the way we were raised in the house, for sure. We never really rested.
Yeah, we always had something going on. We were always going places, always doing things, always around, like you said, important people. And I think there's this inner desire to strive, to move forward. I just also want to put it out there for people. If you have any questions for Jodie or for me, please put those in the chat and we'll be able to see them and to respond to them and answer them for you.
Mama did rest. She meditated all the time. I think I saw rest from Mom. Mm-hmm. Like that idea of just, okay, you don't have to do. You can actually not respond to anything, not react to anything for an hour. Remember she would be meditating and we would want her attention and she'd raise the eyebrow and just silence us. And we were like, okay, don't bother Mama.
Yeah.
And that was different because, our house was like jam-packed with stuff and energy and people and music and ideas. But Mama did sort of quiet it out. And I do meditate now at night to fall asleep. That is the one.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good practice. And I would agree that was something. But they both did. I think, I remember leaving to go to school in the morning and sometimes having friends over and I would peek in and they're like, what are your parents doing in that room? And they were like sitting there going, They were meditating together? Maybe they weren't. I don't, that's not clear to me. I just remember, they both, maybe sometimes they were. But yes, I remember leaving to go to school and like this, the eyebrow for sure, but also they were sitting in there going, and friends were like, what is that? I think that, so yes, I do think that you learn things, clearly you learn things from your parents. You learn like what is normal and natural, quote unquote, from your upbringing. A lot of my friends in their 50s and in their 40s have not done therapy. We started therapy as a family when we were in grade school. So that, it's just a part of whenever I turn to therapy easily. Some people just got that notion in their 40s and 50s, and it's not an easy place for them to land. So that's something that we definitely learned. It was the culture of our home: therapy, talking, meditation, stretching. And do you think that also helps guide you to be a better you? To inform, to dig deeper in and explore yourself and to become a better you?
I think it gets me out of the dark spots. I don't know if I'm better or worse, but I do know that when I'm in a really bad spot, I can get back up from some of those tactics or techniques that Mom and Dad passed on to us, like that tenacity, that, inner quiet, that understanding that it's internal work really that matters the most. So I don't know if it's maybe better, but I think it's made me more capable of getting back up. And I tell my kids now, that was one of the favorite lines for the last 10 years. Winners are losers who just got back up. Like everybody falls. We're not better or worse. Like everyone's going to have these like horrible loser moments. And then the dividing difference is, can you get back up?
Well, now everybody's talking about like failing up, right? This idea that you really have to have some failures to understand how to do the next thing better, how to make adjustments, and that's not something that traditionally, in this world that was or in the United States that's taught. You skip failure, right? This idea of perfectionism. Yeah. And I think that maybe the idea of being involved in sports might have helped us to overcome that idea that, because you do fail, like you are going to lose a match, you're going to lose a competition. You were a competitive gymnast. I was a competitive tennis player, and you lose. So, I mean, there is a dichotomy in that as well, because we lived in such a high powered family that there is over your head, like, okay, you have to win, right? You have to succeed. Like you have to do it at this top level. But then, you're doing things like playing sports and I played tennis and you did gymnastics, and sometimes you're going to lose. I mean, we didn't lose often. I'm going to say that, like you were number 2 in the state. And I was like, until I stopped playing, I think I was 1 or 2 ranked in the ATA. So, I mean, but to say that, I'm saying that to say that, failure is something that we have been taught.
Yes. I remember one time I failed miserably in a gymnastics meet. I had taken some time off because I was in a new school, and I was, like gymnastics is boring kind of concept. Took some time off from gymnastics, realized I really missed it, went back after maybe a half a year off. And my first meet, I couldn't, your muscles are weak, you're not precise, and I failed miserably. And I went running into the closet of the gym to cry. And I remember just dad came with me. He was like, yeah, that was shitty, but you're gonna practice, you're gonna work hard. It's just muscle. You just don't have the muscle right now. Like he really broke it down. Like it's literally just the muscle that you've lost over the last 6 months. So get up, train, do push-ups, and let's keep moving. And he didn't really push too hard. He just was very matter of fact about it, which was great. I do remember him putting his arm around me, and it was no big deal in his eyes, because when you've done so many successes, you've also done so many low points that you realize it's par for the course, Yeah.
And I think that's an important trait to pass on, or important act to pass on to younger people, which brings me to another question. In one of the last podcast I have, a participant asked the question to the interviewee, the guest, and how is it that you can pass on your incredible knowledge to the younger people to get them motivated, to get them to do things? And his answer was, you can't do that. You can't like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. What's your thought on that?
I have 5 kids, and before having multiples, I would have said that much of what you do in your home with your children is how they are. Like you can, sort of craft the culture in your home, and the kids will adopt that culture. But I have one kid that just is an anomaly. He just doesn't. I mean, I talk a lot about my ideas. I make up songs when they were young about the values, like I think every mama has a value that she's bringing to her home. And so it's very clear what my values are and my positioning and the culture. And he really sees the world differently. And so we went head to head for a long time. And the others are kind of like, they go with the flow. I mean, they have their nuanced personalities, but they're much more similar to my culture. I have a feeling that most folks will go with the culture that is in front of them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. In my house, it's a good culture, so it's not like I'm leading them to something negative. But I think there's some of us that just don't bite the culture. There's some of us that literally just are driving from a different beat, and my son, who's 15, he is that. We have different political opinions. We have different ideas on gender, on race, on abortion, on who should have won the presidential vote, on movie selections. I mean, we really are so different. And it was almost like I thought, okay, maybe I haven't drilled down enough on my values and my culture. And so I drilled down more and more, and the divide kept getting harsher. And so now I think that most of us will bite the culture, will adopt the culture. And that's why it's so important to have your kids around good people. But then some of us just have a completely unique spin on life.
Or they come back around. I mean, take me for an example. You know, like we grew up in the same household. You know, pretty much everyone took the same track. You know, our older sisters. But I went completely opposite. I was like, I'm not following this path. You want me to go to college? I'm not going to college just because you said I'm not going to college. You know, and I decided to go off to Europe, and I did all these other things that weren't necessarily on the line of what our family culture was. However, I came back, right? I think at some point that, to me, I think it's quite interesting how, you know, even though you have that culture around your child and they make him go astray, but they come back. And so it'd be interesting to see, you know, 20 years from now, what your 15-year-old does. And tell me a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I hope that he, if you are a proof of that, I hope that he explores everything, you know, literally everything. I hope to be very close enough by his side while he's experiencing everything. And then I hope that wherever he lands, it feels right for him at 20, 30, 40, 50. I think a lot of what you see in our kids who feel rebellious is a response to the culture, right? They're counterculture. And that's, I would imagine, exhausting to constantly counterculture. And then maybe to land wherever it is naturally comfortable to you is what I hope for. You know, even from our kids who are counterculture, that they find a place that is not in response to anything. It's just really about who they are.
So I just wanted to say something funny. You know, doing these live broadcasts, you know, talking about failing up, right? You know, this is all new to me. It kind of was on a whim that I decided I wanted to do a podcast, and it's so fun. And I love talking to people, and I love exploring people, exploring the concepts and ideas of people. And I'm just thinking back, like, to the beginning of this podcast when I said that I had some technical difficulties, and I'm looking back into my my back office, and I'm just realizing that I was like pushing the wrong button the whole time, right? And so it's like, you know. Right. And I'm like, why is it not working? Why is it not working? And that to me is just like a part of this, the evolution of being free to be who you are. And it still comes across with authenticity and with grace and with fire if you have a passion about something. And I just wanted to, you know, talk about, like, what is that like for you when you're walking through life and you have all these huge things on your shoulder? Like, you just wrote a book, you wrote another, you know, you have 2 books on the market right now. You just wrote a very important book about a transgender child, letting his family know that he is not the person he was born as, or the body type that he was born as. And you also are the head of a human rights campaign board. Is that how it's called? Human Rights Campaign Board.
The Human Rights Campaign Foundation Board. And, you know, you have 5 children that you're raising, and you have all these things that are sort of weighted almost on your shoulders. And I can just imagine, like, if I was pushing the wrong button on this simple podcast, what happens when you push the wrong button and you have like a million things on your shoulder? Same thing. Like, it's a good question, right? Because it's inevitable. We're going to get like confused and push the wrong button, and then what's at stake? That's a good question. I think I pushed the wrong button with my kids, and what's at stake is their confidence, their identities, and so that was a learning curve for me. You know, you cannot keep pushing the wrong buttons with your kids. You know, in fact, like, maybe don't push any buttons. Like, let's talk about
right.
talk this through first before you push buttons, because one time you can make a mistake, but if you oftentimes were pushed, like you're pushing that button, right? When we do that with our children, the stakes are so high. So I'm trying my best these days to really back off from that. At work, I like a lot of teamwork, partnerships. So I team up with people. I chair the foundation. There's another person who chairs the board, and we work together. He's like my work husband, and we tag team and have a partnership. So when I show up at a meeting and I don't have the right words, he jumps in. If he shows up at the meeting and he doesn't have the right words, I jump in. I think there's a really important approach to leadership, which is a switch. We've had a lot of domination as leadership, top down, finger pointing, precision, trying to get the highest return on investment from everyone who works underneath you. And I think now we're doing more collaborative leadership from the bottom up, where we're bridging people together and asking everyone's input. So I think, the wrong button is pushed all the time, and your team therefore becomes really important. I think that's how I'm handling it. Yeah.
I have a comment from our aunt, Laura Miraculous. She says, I think you
probably
too.
Mama.
She says, I think you two are perfect examples of having been allowed to unfold, to become who you were born to be, like the title of Jodie's book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Born Ready is the title of the second book, and The Bold World is the title of the first book. Both are pretty applicable, right? I think children are born ready for all the obstacles. And then the adults sort of get in the way and make us believe that we can't. But thanks, Auntie. We had great examples of really strong women. And I do believe that the world needs bold women. That was something that was really great in terms of how our family modeled bold women. It's rare when I walk into the room and I'm stopped by my nervousness. I mean, I get nervous all the time, but it's rare when that stops me. And I think that was partially because of the family we grew up in with so many bold women, the schools that I went to, Spelman College being a women's college. We've had a lot of modeling of strong women, which is a blessing.
We also have Shauna commenting on you pushing the buttons. I love that about maybe not pushing the button when it comes to your kids.
Stay away. Like,
don't push the button.
No, it's like, I mean, you can just take the simplest, most obvious example. I have 5 children. My third child was born anatomically what I thought was female. And by age 2, that child was so sad, angry, grumpy, nail biting until bloody, reoccurring nightmares. The monster's coming to get me, Mama. Angry all the time, fighting, knocking the brothers over, knocking the kids over at the playground, bullying, right? By age 2. And just protesting everything. Didn't want to get dressed, didn't want to brush teeth, didn't want to go outside, did not want me near the child. Like the child was rejecting me, right? Which was different from anything I'd seen, because usually I'm pretty snuggly with my young kids. And so I kept pushing this idea that there's a girl, she just needs reinforcement. Maybe if I give a longer nap, maybe if I take out dairy, thought maybe it was a dairy
right.
Maybe if I do all these things, and maybe if I just keep my values, like pushing on this value that you are strong, you are smart, you are beautiful, you are a girl, everything will work out. Well, I kept pushing that button of you are a bold, strong, smart girl. And the child, Penelope, was getting sadder and angrier. And so the day that everything changed was the day I stopped pushing the button. I stopped pushing that mama button, like, you're going to make it through. You're going to be a smart girl. You're going to be a tough girl. There are so many great women in the world. You're going to be just like Shirley Chisholm. That was the button. And so the day I stopped pushing the button was the day I asked the question, what's really wrong? I've exhausted all my options. What's really wrong? And my child said, well, I'm angry because everyone thinks I'm a girl. And I'm not, I'm a boy. So that was the first time, like when I had pushed the button 1,000 million gazillion times, I stopped pushing it. And it opened up a dialogue with Pinnell to tell me who he is. I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. I might look different, but I am a boy. Like, mind blown.
Heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I would have never gotten to that. I didn't know transgender. I didn't know gender was even flexible. I would have never made it to that understanding of my own son if I had just kept pushing that button that we are strong, proud women. I mean, I am, but he is not. He's a strong, proud man, young man. So that button that we often want to push with our kids, yeah, maybe we ease up.
So I think, it's interesting to me because you're talking about, you kept pushing that button, and Shauna brought up the fact that she really is inspired by that in some way, and maybe she'll use that with her, raising of her children. But it brings me to the fact that, I think it's applicable to everything. I've been on this journey lately in the same way, to not push other people's buttons and to sort of inquire, like why is happening? You have this idea that this person is, has done something purposely, maybe, that's like affecting you. It's affecting the way your work is coming across, or it's, they needed to do something so that you could do something, so you could turn the thing into your boss, or you could, start the podcast, or you could, whatever that said thing is, And lately I've been asking and said, like, are you okay? How are you? As opposed to like, why didn't you call me? Like, I'm waiting for that brief you were supposed to give me. Like, I needed that research paper because I'm starting the podcast in 15 minutes and you never sent it to me. Instead, like, how are you? And I'd like to ask you, do you think that modeling that, like in our ancestors, our parents modeling, I think sometimes they pushed our buttons, but sometimes they sort of just held back and just sort of let it unfold. It was very interesting because we lived in sort of like you said, a conservative household, but it was also this very like hippy dippy household. It was like, we were allowed to wear, like you said, dirty, holey jeans under our dresses. But on the other hand, like our mom wanted us to like learn how to sit at the table properly and use, the right utensils. And, so it was exploring and leaning back, but then also like pushing the button a little, there was sort of like this contrast. And, so what does that mean, like legacy mean to you in terms of that? Like, how does that come across to you?
I mean, I think it was brilliant because life is full of polarities, right? And life is full of these, like, if you can't, it was a bonus, I think, that we can understand conservative patterns, risk-adverse patterns, appropriate patterns, and we can also jump into the fast lane and dive off the deep end. I think it was a bonus that we were taught the dexterity, the mental dexterity. I remember one time Dad said to me, I asked him his opinion on something like, do you think I should, work at the pet shop or work in publishing? And he was like, do you think it matters to me? I'm going to be, this is about your life. And I was like, Mama, Daddy said he's going to die. And she's like, no, he just means that it only matters what matters to you. She had to like translate it, right? Because he was like, I won't exist in your world. This is your destiny, your life. You decide what matters. And it felt so harsh at the time. I thought he was literally talking about he was going to die, but he was willing me into the forefront, right? And so it kind of feels harsh as a kid. I think it's a great thing. I don't know if I would deliver it in that same message to my kids, that I don't care what you do because I'm going to die any day anyway. But I think the idea that we have to be mentally flexible is great. Sometimes we're going to have to go the conservative route. Sometimes we're going to have to be able to jump off the deep end, balls to the wall. So I think this is a good legacy. I hope that I'm passing some of that on to our kids. That it's not one lane. There's just not one lane or one speed of life. In fact, the folks that are just going one speed, I don't, I'm not sure how that's working for them.
Right. So just wanted to pause again and say, like, please, join in to the conversation. I would love to hear things from all of you, and I'm sure Jodie would too. Any questions you have or comments? Lawrence says, oh, mentally flexible. I love it.
Yeah. And I was thinking, like, I think a lot of that is, a feminine energy. Like if you're thinking of energy as yin and yang or masculine and feminine, I think where we're going in this era is more collaborative. It is more flexible. It is about being able to do it one way on a Monday and a second way on a Tuesday. The idea of agility and partnership are much more feminine approaches. And I think that's when we talk about leadership, or how our family has raised us. Although you've seen a lot of great men in our family, I think that we actually, as a family, possess a lot of feminine energy, even the men. And so I think what I've been trying to do with my kids is sort of subversively talk to them about this new concept of mothering that I have. This new concept of mothering is genderless. Like, I think that mothering is architecture for the family and for the community. We're literally building up our communities and building up our children and building up our families against the odds. I've seen queer people mother. I've seen brothers mother. I've seen young people mother younger people. So it's not like, when we talk about leadership or mothering, we're talking about usually adults raising little people that are genetically connected. I like this idea of leadership that is genderless, mothering that is genderless. And so that's something I've been trying to pass on to my kids. It's a new approach. It's a new concept when I articulate it that way. But I think it's something that's been passed down in our family. Genderless mothering.
How can you give an example of how it was passed down in our family?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at Dad's approach, he's extreme. When you look at our dad, he's very masculine. He's heavy-handed, so you would think, and he's very opinionated. So you think he's all machismo. But the ideas that and the way he maneuvered through life is he actually embraces a lot of feminine qualities. He was mentally flexible. He was collaborative in many ways. He partnered with people to get his ideas to the forefront. Although he was dominant in our household, I think in life he was much more collaborative. That is a feminine attribute. So I think in some ways, even the men in our family have this concept of mothering. Even if it wasn't, and I'll take it past our family. I think Black culture was able to blossom the way it has. Black churches came up because of this sort of mothering. HBCUs came up because of this sort of mothering. Black Wall Street came up because of this sort of mothering that I'm talking about, this like architectural designing of communities against the odds, collaborative work. So that's, I think I'm just riffing off of this idea of like what was passed down to us. And I think it is, you look at the strong men in our family, and you might say it was very patriarchal, but you look at the concepts that we learned, mental flexibility, collaboration. These are mothering techniques.
Teresa says, I love that approach. It seems like it provides the freedom of self-determination.
We learn self-determination from what? Great-great-great-grandma, Lurleen. I mean, that was something that we were like raised on, this idea that you can determine, it comes from inside.
Yeah, or even if you go back further than that, our great-grandfather, Harrison Blackwell, his mother was an entrepreneur. When Black women entrepreneurs, that wasn't likely.
There was no Instagram.
There was no Instagram, right?
Well, very easily. Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting. It's hard to, I think when you look at Black families, whether they were middle class, upper middle class, or lacking of financial resources, there's this continuing energy that taught children to succeed against the odds, right? It taught us that unity was really important, Kujichagulia, self-determination. It taught us that umoja, or unity, was a key element. And so that you have in the Black community concepts that you might not articulate, but we all know them. You stick together, You raise up, you get up. If something has failed miserably, you get up, you stick together. You might divorce, but you're never going to really, you're never, as a family, you're never gonna really divorce, right? Might be divorced on paper, but so I think some of these concepts of how you and I were raised are very fundamental across the board in Black families. Whether we verbalize them or not, most Black people I know can tell you these values, these core values of unity, of self-determination, of perseverance.
Mm-hmm. So Lerma, our aunt again, says, are the children interested in family history, way back when history?
Yes. So I usually have like a big display in my house of like portraits of all the mostly women in the family, from, you know, at least one iconic picture of each woman in the family. And I try to go from the, you know, the oldest picture. And then I used to stand the kids up and like tell them stories. This is your great great grandmother. This is your aunt. This is your cousin. And they're always, well, what did she do? What did she say? And what else? What else? So they love the stories of the family. And we now have phones that store thousands of photographs. And so we sometimes will flip through those iPhone photographs and talk about the family all the time at dinner. I think there's an interest in the legacy that I've seen in my kids. Their father's from Ghana, and they recently went to Ghana for the first time. And the shock of how deep that culture is made my heart just, you know, open up. They were so proud to see their family in Ghana, in the village, in the city, and the language and the dress and the customs. I think our kids want they want the legacy.
Can you name one?
The hard part is that, sorry, just to follow up on that thought, I think that it's a human nature to crave the legacy. And unfortunately, Black history, women's history, LGBT history is often like oral history. So it like requires the parents or the aunties or the, you know, the mothers of the culture to pass it down. We're not always in the books. So like, you know, the kids can't go to the library and pick up the book of our legacy. It requires us to pass that legacy down, that oral history of Black folks and women folks and LGBT folks. So there's a lot of need for families to pass that down.
What's one story that you could tell your children about your mother and how she inspired you to be successful the way you are?
So when I was in grade school, I went to a school called Bank Street, and we did, it was like sort of alternative education. And so I don't remember what year it was, but we were learning to write papers, essays. The concept of an essay when you're young is so complex and difficult, right? And so you have to start with an idea, which is broad, and then you get narrow with your details, and then you open that concept again at the end of the paper and you go broad again, right? It's an hourglass shape. But as a kid, when you're first learning to articulate your thoughts into a paper, it's like impossible. So Mama would sit with me for hours as if it were her paper. She would write this paper with me, and she would sit with me for hours, and she would say, well, how about we say it this way? And oftentimes she would say the words, she would put the words into my mouth. I wouldn't have any words. She would say, well, why don't we say it this way? And I'd say, well, that sounds great. Let's do that. And then she would say, well, let's write it together. She would put her hand on top of my hand and help me write the story or the essay. And we did that for a year. I mean, it's damn near plagiarism. I mean, technically, she was writing these papers, but by the end of that school year, I wrote my own papers and I've become a writer. She literally held my hand on top of the pencil and wrote it for me. She gave me the words for me. And that's how you learn. You know, for me, that's how I learned to write. I learned to be not afraid to write. I learned it's okay to riff with people when you write. Like, it's not necessarily a solo act. You can have collaborators to help you get the words out. So Mama, she really taught me how to write and how to creatively get my ideas on paper.
I think that's pretty amazing. I've kind of done the same thing with Yana, not necessarily in terms of my daughter Yana, not necessarily in terms of writing, but as a child, it was just things were very difficult for her to follow instructions. And so I would do the same thing. I would literally place her body where she was supposed to go. Okay, so now you're going to stand here. And then when you get here, you're going to bend down, and I would move her body down, you know, and you're going to pick up the wrench or whatever it is. And then you're going to walk some meters, you know, and then you're going to hand over the wrench to Tony, and he will then do blah, 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 you know. So it was this act of like moving her along and showing her like what to do. And, you know, now she's a very successful, you know, woman, and she doesn't need me to do that. But in that age, she needed me to do that. I think, you know, to close out, you know, we have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to kind of talk about trauma and how trauma lives in the Black community and has lived in our family, and how you have overcome trauma, but also used that in a way, or have you used that in a way to fuel your success?
You know, I've been in this space over the last year of like not wanting to consume trauma, not wanting to tell stories of trauma, not wanting to feed into trauma. And one of the reasons, not that trauma doesn't exist, I think I've just been overloaded. We have been overloaded with trauma. Like we see it. It's very easy for the news to throw out these images of the trauma to the Black body, trauma to Black men, trauma to the Black community, LGBT community. You see it all the time. And so the second book so this was an intentional discussion of not trauma, but triumph. Like the LGBT story, the trans story is often told as a dramatic story that doesn't end well. And I wanted to tell it from a triumphant perspective that will end well. And I think that the way I wrote this book is probably how I'm feeling right now in life. I don't really want to I don't want to talk about trauma. And people ask me all the time, what was the hardest part about raising a trans kid? Like, when was the first time you cried? How did someone ever bully him? You know, like they ask you these very pointed questions about when it was hard, when it was sad, and they want to feed on those moments. And so, not to avoid your question, but I am not feeding the trauma now. I'm feeding the triumph. Because there's a million stories that we can tell. I'm just not dwelling in those stories right now. I'm dwelling in the triumph.
So how have you triumphed? Let's look at that. Like, how have you named the way that you have triumphed from your adversity or trials?
Well, I was married. I was in 2 relationships that I thought were like the end all and be all, and two of those relationships ended, and life did not end for me. And that's really difficult for women, right? This idea that I think women are rooted in the home, they're rooted in the family, they're rooted in sensibility and being cautious and being respectful. And when some of those things fall or fail, like my 2 marriages crumbled in a sense, that was felt at some point like a failure. And I was really nervous. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get up and do things with my life and produce, right, and provide for my kids. And so the triumph for me is that my life has just continued to get stronger, even after 2 relationships. And I'm saying that like almost, you know, the aha moment is that for women, we feel that failed relationships are failures, and they're not, right? I know people have talked about this a million times over, but for me, when I experienced that, I wrote 2 books after my marriages. I bought property for myself with my own money after marriages. I had better relationships with my kids that I worked on, right? After my marriages. To me, that felt like I did it. So that was a triumph. Just being like a woman at 50, quote unquote, single woman, right? With these babies' kids. A lot of people written that off as like a bad story that was spiraling downward. And for me, that's just has not been the case. So the triumph is in life. The triumph is in female independence, whether you're married or not. The triumph is in pushing your limits to find what more haven't you tapped into. I found new resources in myself that I didn't know I had. So I was triumphant. Triumph was understanding my kid to be trans, not losing a kid because I didn't understand his identity. That happens a lot. You lose kids when we don't support them. He's a strong student. He's a strong sibling, loving friend, great athlete. That feels like a triumph for me, that I have a son named Pinnell who is transgender and Black and does not have the weight of the world on his shoulders. To me, that feels like, we did it right. Because I've seen it go I've seen it go the other way. I mean, not to get political, but there are like over 100 anti-trans bills on the table up for grabs, over 250 anti-LGBT bills, just to show you the culture of what's happening right now. So when you have a family that is queer and Black, that is like doing well and happy and together, that feels like triumph, because the backdrop is like
weighty, heavy,
asking us to go away, to go some place far, far away.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, now we're here, we're good.
We're here to stay.
Yeah.
So in the last few minutes, I guess if you were to summarize, the triumph, the victories, the legacy that we talked about that is in our family, and if you were to bundle that up into a ball and be able to give one or two words of wisdom to future generations and to the listeners, and I know that's a very heavy question to ask, is there a way for you to dig inside of you and say, like, this is something that I would like to pass on and or was passed on to me?
Yes. And I'm going to go back to what Aunt Lerma said. What I think resonated the loudest for me, all the people who raised us, the men and the women, the cousins, the aunties, the coaches, the community that mothered us. I think the strongest takeaway for me was that you literally are born with this. You're born with it. You don't have to, you will experience everything. You're going to go in a million different directions. And in fact, you should. And the community, the mamas, the fathers will be right by your side, close by. You'll fall, you'll fail. But actually what you're doing in those experiences are just getting closer to this golden stuff inside of you. It is inside of you. You're born with it. You're born ready. I think a lot of times we're sending children out to find things in their grades, out to find them in the hairstyles, out to find them in sex, out to find things, answers in companies and bonuses and cars. And what we did learn was that it was inside of us. And that's like a lot of what Daddy taught us and Mommy, that when you tap back in, you're going to go out there and experience it. But when you tap back in, that's where the real answer is. So I would say you're born ready, experience it all. We'll be right here near you. And then when your time is ready, you will tap in and it will be right there. Tap, tap, tap in.
And you'll go forth and you'll be who you are born to be.
Yeah, I think.
Well, this has been such a great experience talking with you. I don't think that we have had the chance to talk in this way before and kind of explore our own family legacy, explore what has enabled you to be so successful and do all these extraordinary things. And it's been such a pleasure. And I appreciate that you let me get on your calendar for my podcast. And it's just
fun. It was a good conversation. And I think you're right. I mean, talk about taking your own path. There were years when we didn't speak. We took our own paths. You explored. I explored in my own way. We were on just different paths. And I think eventually, another thing is just time. Like, we are rushing. We could just you could just stop the rushing because it's actually literally moving with or without us. So I think a lot of it is time. We came back to a point where our lives are touching again because of time. I don't think we did anything in particular. We didn't like go to therapy together. It's just, so this idea, I love that we're sitting here talking on this podcast, because look at us 3 years ago, we weren't talking. I was like,
right.
I don't need not today.
Not today.
Not today, sir. So yeah, that's another thing. Just like let it flow.
Let it flow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we'll leave it with that. Let it flow. Tap into your internal powers, tap into your legacy, tap into your ancestors. Thank you, Jodie Paterson, for being on my podcast. What is it like to be? Thank you, everyone, for joining, and peace out. Have a good night.
Bye.